Before first light on a farm in Iceland in the 10th century, the only proof that the household survived the night is a sound. Someone kneeling at the long hearth, breathing on cold ash, low and steady until one dull coal remembers how to be fire. The turf walls hold the cold the way a bank of earth holds it, absolutely. And the single room under that turf roof has sheltered a dozen people through 5 months of darkness, without once, if the household is careful, letting that fire go out. Whoever tends it now is not being sentimental. Losing the flame here is not an inconvenience. It is the first domino in a chain that ends with frozen hands and spoiled food, and within a season, a grave. This is a portrait of one such day and the night that follows it, built from the law codes, sagas, and excavated farms that record how people actually lived through the Viking Age, rather than how later centuries like to picture them. No single dramatic danger runs through it. What runs through it instead is arithmetic. 1,000 small burdens, each survivable alone, all arriving at once, hour after hour for the length of a single sunrise to the next. A person raised on central heating, antibiotics, and a refrigerator would not fail this day at any one terrible moment. There is no dragon in it. There is only every hour asking something the body and the law and the weather do not forgive twice. Keep an eye on 3 small things as the day goes on. The long fire down the center of the hall, the plain iron knife worn at nearly every hip on the farm, and a notched stick by the storehouse door that keeps a running count of exactly how many days the winter's food still has left in it. Each one looks unremarkable. Each one is load-bearing. The hearth runs down the center of the hall, a shallow stone-lined trench of ash and buried coal. And it is the only reason anyone in this house is still breathing comfortably at an hour when the world outside is black rock and blacker sky. There is no chimney anywhere in the building. Smoke climbs, spreads under the turf roof and finds a vent cut at the ridge, or does not find it fast enough, and the whole room keeps a permanent gray haze at head height. That every person here has breathed since infancy, none of that matters at this hour. What matters is that somewhere under last night's ash, a coal is still alive, and a woman on her knees at the hearth edge is coaxing it back with slow, patient breath, feeding it wisps of dried grass and sheep dung before she trusts it with wood. She does this every morning of her life, and she does it first, before food, before the animals, before anything, because the fire is the one piece of the household's equipment that cannot be replaced quickly if it fails. Iceland in this century has few trees left worth the name. The settlers found birch scrub covering the lowlands when they arrived a lifetime or two ago, and 3 generations of clearing it for fields and firewood and charcoal have left hillsides that used to be wooded, now bare to the wind. A family that lets its fire die on a black winter morning cannot simply walk to a neighbor's hearth for a coal. The nearest farm may be an hour's walk through snow that will take fingers and toes on the way. Flint and steel exist, carried by some households, and a spark can be struck from them onto dry tinder if it must be. But striking new fire from nothing, in the wet cold before dawn, with hands already stiffening, can take far longer than anyone comfortable in a warm room ever imagines. And a household that has to do it too often is a household advertising to itself and to its neighbors that it cannot be trusted to keep the basic machinery of survival running. So the fire is banked, not extinguished, every single night, raked into a bed of its own ash, which insulates the coal beneath the way the turf insulates the house above it, so that a living ember can, with luck and a practiced hand, still be found in the morning after 8 hours of black cold. The whole shape of the building serves this one requirement. The hall is long and low and windowless, but for a smoke hole and perhaps one small skin-covered opening near the roof, built that way because a smaller volume of trapped air is a volume that holds heat. And heat, this far north, is not comfort. It is the difference between a working hand and a frostbitten one, between a full night's sleep and one broken by shivering, between health and the wasting cough that a cold, damp house breeds into weak lungs by midwinter. Raised benches of packed earth or timber line both long walls, doubling as seats by day and beds by night, and the entire household, parents, children, a hired hand or two, the farm's unfree laborers, sleeps within a few feet of one another and of that fire, because heat shared is heat multiplied, and privacy is a luxury this house has never had the fuel to afford. The coal catches. It always seems to take longer than it did the morning before, and this morning is no different. A curl of smoke, a stubborn refusal, and then finally, a small orange flare that means the day can begin. The woman feeds it twigs, then a split length of driftwood, timber that likely came off a beach rather than a forest, since Iceland now imports more of its good wood than it grows, and stands only once she is certain it will hold. At her belt, where it rides every hour she is awake, is a small iron knife, worn smooth at the handle from years of exactly this kind of work, cutting kindling, cutting bread, cutting whatever the next hour demands of her. She uses it now to shave a stick into curls that will catch faster than the whole piece would. It is not a special tool. It is simply never absent. The one piece of equipment every person on this farm owns and carries and could not easily replace. And by the day's end it will have done a dozen jobs no one thought to name in advance. The smoke that never quite finds the vent fast enough is its own quiet cost, paid over years rather than in any one morning. Modern doctors examining Norse-era remains have found lungs and airways marked by a lifetime of indoor smoke exposure, and eyes chronically reddened were common enough that Norse language has old words for the condition. No one in this hall would call it a hazard. It is simply the smell and sting of being warm, and being warm is not optional, so the point is not debated. On the coldest nights, when the wind finds every seam in the turf, the water left standing in a pail near the outer wall can grow a skin of ice by morning, while the sleepers nearer the hearth stay merely cold, rather than dangerously so. A small daily lesson in exactly how much the fire is doing and how little margin lies on either side of it. The rest of the house is waking around her in stages the way it does every morning. Someone shifting on the packed earth bench along the wall, a child pulled deeper into a shared blanket rather than surrendering the last of the warmth, a low exchange of words, too sleep-thick to carry meaning yet. There is no room in this building that is only for sleeping, no door that closes on a private version of the night. Whatever happens here, a birth, a death, a quarrel, a reconciliation, happens in front of everyone, because the same walls that keep the cold out make privacy a thing this household simply does not have the fuel or the timber to build. It is one more cost tallied against the same ledger as the smoke and the ice, warmth bought, again, with something else given up. Outside, past the turf wall, the sky over the ridge is still doing nothing that could be called dawn. Somewhere close by, penned animals that have not been fed since dusk are becoming audible, and that sound is the one that ends the firekeeper's brief moment of stillness. The house is warm enough now to survive an hour without her constant attention. The rest of the farm is not waiting. Whoever goes to the animals first goes with a lamp, and the lamp is a small stone bowl of fish oil with a floating wick, giving off a light so weak it barely reaches an arm's length, and a smell no one on the farm still notices. At several excavated farms of this period, archaeologists have found the family's living quarters and the animals' winter housing under one continuous turf roof, divided only by a timber partition, close enough that the herd's body heat measurably warms the human end of the building on the coldest nights. That closeness is not an accident of poverty, though poverty is part of it. It is a decision, repeated by household after household, that the fastest way to lose a winter is to make the animals walk farther from warmth and shelter than the humans do. By this hour, the cattle in the byre have gone 8 or 9 hours without feed and are loud about it, and there is real urgency in getting hay into their mouths, because the arithmetic behind every animal on this farm is far less forgiving than it looks. Icelandic summers are short, and the growing season shorter still. The entire hay harvest a household will live on for 8 months has to be cut, dried, and stored, across perhaps 10 or 12 weeks of a single summer. And if that summer is wet or cold, or simply short on sun, the hay comes in thin, and the math for winter changes for the worse before a single frost has fallen. A farmer does not discover a hay shortfall in a crisis. A farmer knows the shortfall in September, does the sum against the number of animals in the byre, and makes a choice no modern grocery shopper ever has to make: which beasts eat through to spring, and which are slaughtered now before they can starve slowly and take the family's own margin down with them. This morning's feeding is the small, unglamorous end of that same calculation. Hay is carried in from the store in armfuls, doled out by a hand that has already done this sum in his head without needing to say it aloud, because giving one animal too generous a portion this early in the winter is a decision that borrows against every animal's ration in March, the leanest month of all. Sheep, hardier and less demanding, may still be let out to scrape at exposed pasture on a mild morning, working through snow for whatever grass survives beneath it. Cattle, less suited to the climate and far more valuable per head, rarely leave the byre at all between the first hard frost and the thaw. A milking cow is wealth on 4 legs, convertible into cheese, into meat and hide if she must be slaughtered, into a dowry, into standing among the farm's neighbours, and she is entirely dependent, for 5 or 6 months of the year, on hay that a household's own hands cut and dried and hauled home while the weather still allowed it. The pre-dawn round through the byre is also, without anyone naming it that way, a health inspection. A beast gone off its feed, breathing wrong, or down and unable to rise is not a minor concern to be watched for a few days, the way a modern owner might watch a pet. It is a household's food and fuel budget for the next several months, visibly failing, and every hour of delay in noticing it is an hour closer to losing the whole animal instead of only some of its value. Fingers already numb from the cold check flanks and udders by touch, as much as by the failing lamp's light. A bucket goes under the first cow that will stand for it, and the milk that comes up warm in the cold air is the morning's first real income, destined within the hour to become the thin, soured, endlessly stretched staple that will get this household through to the next thing worth calling a meal. Not every animal in the byre is treated alike, and the differences matter more than a stranger to the farm would guess. Horses, prized for travel and status as much as for work, are hardy enough that some are left to fend for themselves outdoors even in hard weather, scraping through snow for grass in a way that would kill an ill-suited cow within days. Goats browse where sheep will not, and are kept as much for that willingness as for their milk. A household's 1 or 2 pigs, an animal that puts on weight fast, but competes directly with people for anything worth eating, are becoming rarer on Icelandic farms than they were in the earliest settlement years, when the newcomers still farmed as though the birch woods around them were as endless as the ones they had left behind, before 2 or 3 generations of clearing and grazing taught harder lessons about what this particular island could actually support. Every animal in the byre this morning represents a choice already made months or years ago about what this farm could afford to keep alive. There is still the rest of the byre to finish, water to break free of ice and haul, and the manure that has to be mucked out and piled, because it will be spread on the home field come spring, and is, in its own unglamorous way, as valuable to next year's hay crop as the animals producing it are to this year's table. Packed against the byre's outer wall, in fact, that same manure does a second job before it ever reaches the field. Layered and left to settle, it adds another skin of insulation against the cold, exactly where the animals need it most. Waste turned to building material by a household that has never had the luxury of treating anything as only one thing. The hand doing this work straightens once, briefly, to work feeling back into his fingers, and looks toward the house, where a thread of smoke is finally rising steady from the roof vent. The fire has held. That is one problem solved before the sun is even up. It is very far from the last one. Breakfast, such as it is, comes from the storehouse, a small timber and turf building set apart from the hall specifically so that a cooking fire in the main house can never accidentally take the winter's entire food supply with it. Inside, in wooden tubs and skin containers, sits the household's real wealth, more so even than the animals. Barrels of skyr, a soft, intensely sour milk product strained thick and kept submerged in its own way, which acts as a natural preservative and lets the household store a dairy surplus from the short productive months against the long lean ones. Soured whey itself, kept in its own vat, is used to pickle meat that would otherwise spoil in weeks, stretching a single autumn slaughter into a food source that survives, edible if sharp tasting, well into the following year. None of this is improvisation. It is a technology, refined over generations for solving the one problem that overshadows every other concern on this farm. There is a finite amount of food between now and the point when the land starts producing again. And the point when the land starts producing again is not up for negotiation. Beside the storehouse door hangs the household's plainest piece of accounting, a length of wood notched with a knife, one marked for some agreed unit of time, kept by whoever manages the stores, usually the farm's senior woman, so that the whole household has a rough, visible answer to the only question that actually matters through a long winter. How many days can what remains in this room still feed everyone under this roof? It is not a precise instrument. It does not need to be. What it needs to do is turn a vague, gnawing anxiety into a number a person can look at and act on, because the alternative, not knowing, is worse than any specific bad number the tally could show. A shortfall spotted in the deep cold of winter still leaves choices. Slaughter an animal early, ration harder, send word to a wealthier neighbor and accept the debt that comes with the favor. A shortfall discovered too late, in the hollow weeks of early spring after the old stores are gone and the first grass has not yet grown enough to matter, leaves almost none. That stretch of early spring has a name in the folk memory of every farming society that has ever lived close to its own harvest, because it recurs with such reliability. The hungry gap, the weeks after the previous year's stores are exhausted and before the new season has produced anything at all. Diets thin sharply in these weeks. Meals that were merely plain become genuinely short, and the household's youngest, oldest, and sickest are the ones who suffer first and most visibly, their growth stunted or their resistance to the season's illnesses quietly weakened in ways a modern doctor, looking at the bones decades later, can still read. It is deep winter, and the stores so far are holding, but every adult in this hall has lived through at least one spring when they were not holding, and the memory sits under every meal like a second unspoken guest. The meal itself is modest by any modern standard, and would have been recognized as ordinary by everyone eating it. A portion of skyr thinned with a little of that whey, perhaps a piece of hard, dark bread made from barley grown on the farm's own infield during a stretch of unusually mild decades that has made grain growing more viable here than it will be again for centuries, and dried fish, split and hung to cure in the wind off the shore, gnawed rather than cut. Butter, churned and salted, is stretched thin across the household and rationed with real care, because the milk it comes from is itself seasonal, plentiful in summer and dwindling hard once most of the herd stops producing for the winter. There is no coffee to wake anyone, no sugar to soften anything, no salt to spare in any quantity beyond what preserving the winter's meat has already used. What there is, this particular morning, is enough, and enough is the entire measure of success this household applies to a meal. The tally by the storehouse door gets a glance this morning, the way it does most mornings, from the household's senior woman, the one who holds the keys to that building, and answers more than anyone else on the farm for what is left in it. She has run this count through hard winters before and knows the particular danger of a season that still looks comfortable in month 3, and she portions the bread this morning very slightly smaller than she might have a month ago. A decision made silently and adjusted by feel rather than by any written rule, because there is no written rule. There is only her judgment, sharpened by winters that punished households whose judgment was worse. A child at the bench reaches for a second piece before the basket has gone all the way around, and is quietly redirected rather than refused outright. One of the 100 small daily negotiations by which a household stretches a fixed amount of food across every mouth that depends on it, without anyone going hungry enough to remember the day precisely, or so full that another mouth goes short. A modern eater set down at this table would likely find the food monotonous, sour, and thin on flavor by the standards of a kitchen with a spice shelf. They would very quickly find it something else as well, filling only just enough to get a body through a full day's hardest labor, with nothing held in reserve for a body unused to the work ahead of it. That labor is already waiting outside, and the light, such as it is at this latitude in winter, will not stretch far enough to waste any of it on lingering over a bowl. With the animals fed and the fire settled, the morning's work does not so much begin as simply change shape. Fuel has to come in from the store where last summer's cut turf and dried peat are stacked. Because the hearth alone burns through a serious quantity of it across a single winter day, and driftwood, however it is stretched, is never quite plentiful enough to rely on for everything. The load is heavy and awkward, carried on the back or dragged on a sled of lashed wood over frozen ground, and it is only the first of several such loads this particular morning will require. Snow banked against the outbuildings has to be cut and cleared before it presses hard enough on a turf roof to threaten it. An unglamorous task that nonetheless has to be done by someone with a wooden shovel in the same cold that already has fingers aching from the byre. There is no day set aside from this. Iceland is still, in this generation, a pagan country in law as much as in practice. The formal turn to Christianity is still decades off, and with it, eventually, the idea written into custom that one day in 7 belongs to rest rather than work. For now there is only the work the season demands, and winter, whatever comfortable modern instinct says about farms lying dormant until spring, demands a great deal of it. Tools to mend before they are needed rather than after, hides to scrape and cure, rope to lay from wool or hair, fences and byre timbers to shore up against wind that has already found every weakness once and will find it again, A hand unoccupied for an hour on this farm is treated, by everyone including its owner, as a hand not yet given its next job, and idleness carries a faint social cost of its own that has nothing to do with any law at all. A neighbor who hears that a household sat by its fire all morning while the fences sagged draws his own conclusions about that household's judgment, and judgment out here is close to the only currency that matters. None of this work is efficient by any standard a modern laborer would recognize from a workplace with machinery. Everything is done by hand, by back, by the leverage of a body against wood, stone, and frozen earth, hour after hour, week after week, for as many decades as that body holds out. It leaves a mark that outlasts the person leaving it. Archaeologists studying skeletons recovered from Viking Age burial grounds in Scandinavia and Iceland alike have repeatedly found joints, shoulders, elbows, lower spines, the base of the big toe, showing wear more commonly associated in a modern clinical setting with people decades older than the Norse skeleton in question actually was at death. Enthesopathies, the small roughened patches where a tendon has pulled hard and often enough against bone to change its shape, turn up on hands and forearms with a regularity that tells its own quiet story about what an ordinary working life here actually costs the body carrying it. This is not the record of occasional strain. It is the record of a species of labor that simply never stopped being asked of the same joints, year after year, from adolescence to whatever age a person managed to reach. The hand hauling fuel this morning does not think of any of this in such terms, of course. He thinks, if he thinks about his own body at all, in much smaller units, this load, then the next one, then whatever the midday meal turns out to be, then the afternoon's version of the same question. But his shoulders already carry, at an age a modern office worker would still call young, a permanent list to one side from years of favoring a particular carrying motion, and his hands are thickened and scarred in ways that a modern hand, however capable, generally is not, because a modern hand has rarely had to learn a trade this unforgiving quite this early, or keep at it quite this long without any real prospect of a different kind of work. Put a soft, well-fed visitor from a heated house into this same morning, handed the same sled and the same load of frozen turf, and the visitor's failure would not be dramatic. It would simply be exhaustion arriving hours before the work was anywhere near finished, and a body discovering, in real time, exactly how much of what it calls ordinary strength it has never actually had to use. By the time the fuel store is stocked back up to where it should be, the gear that keeps this household fed from the sea, it's the same unglamorous attention. Fishing lines of twisted horsehair or plaited plant fiber fray and snap with ordinary use, and nets, however carefully woven, tear on rock and ice and need mending before the next calm day makes a trip worth risking. A torn net taken out and lost to a hard afternoon is not a small loss to shrug off. It is weeks of some household member's evening labor gone in an afternoon, and so the mending gets done now, stiff-fingered rather than gambled on later. Hides from the autumn slaughter still need scraping clean of fat and flesh before they can be worked into usable leather, a cold, smelling, entirely unglamorous task that nonetheless has to happen before the material rots rather than cures, and it falls like so much else this morning to whichever pair of hands is not already committed to something else. And the worst of the drifted snow is cleared, the light outside, such as it is this deep into winter, with the sun barely troubling to clear the ridge before it starts sinking again, has moved further than the morning's work feels like it should have allowed. There is a second round of chores waiting that has nothing to do with muscle at all, and it belongs on this farm as on most others, almost entirely to the women of the household, who have already been at their own version of ceaseless labor since before anyone else was properly awake. The loom stands against the gable wall where the light is best, a tall upright frame strung with warp threads that hang straight down under the pull of fired clay weights, and it is rarely in any season standing idle. Weaving wool into usable cloth on a frame like this is slow work by nature, a single row built up thread by thread with a handheld beater, and it sits at the far end of a chain of labor that starts months earlier with a sheep's back and does not finish until a finished piece of cloth, fulled and dyed if the household can spare the effort and materials for dyeing, is finally cut and sewn into something wearable. Every stage of that chain, shearing, cleaning the raw fleece of its grease and dirt, carding it into workable fiber, spinning it into thread on a hand spindle turned and dropped, over and over, spun and wound, is done by hand, mostly by the women of the household, in whatever hour of daylight or firelight is not already claimed by something else. The scale of it is easy for a modern household, used to buying clothing finished and cheap, to badly underestimate. Researchers who have reconstructed the whole process using historical tools and timed it stage by stage have produced an estimate that still startles people the first time they hear it. The wool sailcloth needed to rig a single ship of this era, several hundred square feet's worth of tightly woven fabric, strong enough to hold wind without tearing, could represent more hours of spinning and weaving labor than the shipwrights spent building the hull it would be hung from. A ship is a carpenter's triumph and gets the songs. The sail that actually moves it across open water is a woman's accumulated labor, invisible in the telling, indispensable in the doing, and no voyage this farm's men might ever make happens without it. This morning's work will not produce a sail. It will produce at most a hand's width more of plain cloth toward a garment someone in this house needs replaced before the cold gets worse, and the woman at the loom knows, without needing to calculate it consciously, roughly how many more mornings like this one stand between the cloth in front of her and a finished coat. Wool has one real advantage that makes all of this bearable, rather than merely endless. Unlike linen or cotton, it insulates even when damp, which matters enormously in a climate where staying entirely dry is not always an option. And a household's whole strategy for surviving the outdoor cold, every layer of it, rests on this one animal fiber and the uncounted hours required to turn it into something wearable. Norse law and custom give the woman running this loom a standing that would surprise anyone who assumed the sheer weight of her daily labor meant she counted for little beyond it. She can, under the law of this land, own property in her own right, control the wealth she brought into a marriage rather than surrender it entirely to her husband's management, and in the right circumstances initiate a divorce herself if a marriage has genuinely failed, a real legal option available to few women in most of contemporary Christian Europe. The keys that hang at her belt, to the storehouse and to whatever else in the household is locked, are not a decorative badge. They are the literal instruments of an authority that is hers by custom the moment she marries into running a household, an authority a husband does not hold and cannot simply take from her. None of that changes the arithmetic of her actual day, which any modern observer would recognize instantly as brutal. Keeping the stores, directing whatever household labor is not already spoken for, raising the children old enough to be underfoot and young enough to still need her, and producing personally, hour after hour, the literal clothing that keeps this entire household from freezing, on top of every task that already belongs to her from the moment the fire needed waking before dawn. It is not a comfortable balance. Real legal standing set against a workload. Before any of it reaches the loom, the raw fleece has already passed through hours of preparation that rarely make it into any telling of this craft. Greasy wool worked with hand cards or dried teasels until the fibers lie roughly parallel, then drawn out and spun on a weighted drop spindle, twisted and wound, in a motion so practiced that many women of this household do it standing, walking between other tasks, rather than ever sitting down specifically to spin. Color, when the household can spare the effort for it, comes from plants and lichens gathered locally rather than from anything traded in. Muted earth tones far more often than the vivid dyes a wealthier household, further along the coast, might import at real expense. And the loom is only one branch of this craft, not the whole of it. Mittens and socks, the garments that stand between bare skin and a genuinely dangerous cold, are more often built by a separate technique entirely. A single bone or wood needle, looping and knotting a single length of yarn into a dense, wind-resistant fabric that, unlike woven cloth, will not unravel outright if a stitch fails. An important property on feet that cannot afford to discover a hole in the sock 3 hours from the house. The plainest grade of this household's woven wool, a coarse homespun cloth known across the island as vatmal, is worth so much to a country that otherwise mints no coin of its own, then the law itself fixes its value and accepts lengths of it as valid payment for debts, fines, and rents. A length of ordinary cloth, doing the work a modern household would hand to currency. The woman at this loom is not only clothing her family thread by thread, on paper, however invisibly to her own sense of the morning, she is also striking a kind of coin, with no visible bottom, and no one on this farm would pretend it is. It is simply the arrangement this society has settled on generation after generation, and the loom does not pause to debate it. Thread by thread, the row grows. The smith works from a low shed set apart from the main hall. Both for the smoke and for the fire risk, a working forge always represents to a building roofed in turf over dry timber, and by midday his own hearth has usually been going for hours. Iceland has no rich deposits of the kind of ore that mainland smiths further east can dig from open ground, but it has bog iron ore that forms slowly in wet, acidic ground from dissolved iron gathering and hardening over years, gathered laboriously from marsh and moor and smelted down in a process that consumes an enormous quantity of charcoal for a comparatively small yield of usable metal. Every nail, every hinge, every axe head and blade on this farm represents that same laborious chain running backward: charcoal burned, ore smelted, bloom hammered and folded and hammered again to drive out impurities before a smith ever begins shaping the specific tool a household actually needs. Iron on an island short of good ore and short of the fuel to smelt what ore it has is never treated as disposable. The single most common iron object on this farm, and on nearly every farm like it across the Norse world, is not a sword or an axe. It is the plain, unremarkable knife that rides at the hip of almost everyone old enough to be trusted with a blade, sheathed in leather or wood, sharpened on a stone kept for the purpose, and used for absolutely everything: cutting food, cutting cord, skinning, whittling, working leather, settling the 100 small tasks that come up in an hour of ordinary life and need a cutting edge to solve. Archaeologists opening Viking Age graves across Scandinavia and Iceland find this same knife turning up with extraordinary consistency, buried alongside men, women, and children alike, not as a weapon of status, but as the one tool considered too essential to bury a person without. It is, in the most literal sense available to archaeology, the single most universal possession of this entire culture. That universality carries a harder edge that this farm does not spend much time examining out loud, because examining it would mean admitting something uncomfortable about the world just past the boundary fence. A knife carried for cutting bread is, by the same stroke, always available for something else, and in a society where every free adult male is expected to own weapons and know how to use them, the line between a tool and a weapon is a matter of intention rather than object. Swords are rarer, genuinely expensive, and carry real prestige. A fine blade, its fuller sometimes inlaid with lettering by smiths whose reputation traveled with the steel itself, can be worth more than a small farm, and gets named and handed down like a title. But it is the ordinary knife, not the sword, that actually settles most of the sudden, ugly moments this society produces, because it is the blade that is always already there, at the hip, the instant an argument stops being only words. The smith today is finishing a repair rather than forging anything new. His son, 12 or 13, and already spending more hours at his father's forge than anywhere else on the farm, works the bellows and watches everything with the close, silent attention of an apprentice who understands this trade is the one skill on the whole farm that cannot be picked up casually in a season. Smithing here is closer to an inherited craft than a chore, passed down deliberately because bad iron work on tools a household's whole winter depends on is a mistake this family cannot easily absorb. If either of them ever saw a genuinely fine blade up close, a trader's sword rather than a farm knife, they might find lettering worked into the metal near the hilt, the mark of smiths whose reputation for a particular, unusually hard style of steel traveled the length of the trade routes reaching this island, a name stamped into iron the way a modern maker might stamp a brand, and worth, blade for blade, more than several farms like this one put together. Nothing forged in this shed today will ever be that valuable. It will simply work, which is the only standard that actually matters here. None of this weaponry sits in this shed by simple preference. The law of this land takes an active interest in what a free man carries, requiring men of any real standing to own a specific minimum of arms, and to bring them to the assembly itself, so that the country's free men arrive each summer not merely as litigants and traders, but, if it ever came to it, as a stand-in body capable of enforcing a verdict the ordinary machinery of law cannot enforce on its own. An unarmed household on this farm stretch of coast is not a peaceful household. It is a defenseless one, and the law itself assumes no one wants to be that. A broken rivet on a tool handle, a warped hoe blade that needs straightening under careful, repeated heat. It is unglamorous, necessary work, the kind that keeps a farm's small store of iron functioning at all rather than adding to it. And the smith does it with the unhurried competence of a man who understands exactly how little margin this household has for a broken tool going unrepaired into the coming weeks. He works with his own knife close at hand the whole time, the same as everyone else on the farm, set down within reach rather than sheathed, because a smith mid-task rarely wants a blade any farther from his hand than that, whatever the task actually is. By midday, the sun, low and pale, has done as much climbing as it plans to do at this time of year, and the household is gathering back toward the hall for the meal that marks the day's real middle. It will not be a quiet one. Word has come up the track that a traveler is on the road, and on a farm this isolated, that single fact reorganizes the next several hours of everyone's attention. A stranger on the road toward an isolated farm is never in this world a small piece of news. By the time the traveler is close enough to be recognized as no one from a neighboring farm, half the household already knows he is coming, and the reception that follows is governed by an obligation almost everyone in this society would recognize by heart without ever having had it explained to them formally. A guest arriving at the door is to be received, fed, and sheltered, whatever the household's own stores can spare, because hospitality here is closer to a binding social law than a courtesy. One of the best-known poems to survive from this culture, a long collection of proverb and practical wisdom later written down in an Icelandic manuscript, opens with exactly this concern before it moves on to almost anything else. Specific, practical advice on watching the doors, greeting a newcomer without presuming to know his temper, and giving him water, a towel, and an honest welcome before asking him a single question about his business. Manners, in other words, are not treated here as decoration. They are treated as a survival skill in their own right, worth codifying in verse and repeating until every child in the culture has it memorized. The reason the custom carries this much weight becomes obvious the moment the stranger is actually standing in the doorway. There is no inn on this stretch of coast, no way station, no authority a lost or exhausted traveler can appeal to if a farm turns him away. Refusal can mean a genuine risk to his life in weather that kills the unsheltered with real regularity. And a household that gets a name for turning away travelers earns a reputation that will follow it into every future dealing that depends on trust. A debt collected, a marriage arranged, a dispute settled by neighbors who remember exactly how this family behaves when no law is standing over them to make them behave well. Hospitality, looked at this way, is not sentiment. It is a cheap, reliable way of building the one kind of wealth that a subsistence farm cannot buy outright. A reputation good enough that other households will extend the same courtesy back when this farm's own people are the ones caught out on the road. And yet the household receiving him does not relax the whole time he is inside. A stranger is also, unavoidably, an unknown quantity in a society with no police and no standing court sitting in judgment down the road, where a guest's welcome and a guest's danger are simply two properties of the same visit, weighed constantly rather than resolved once at the door. Weapons stay close but out of open provocation. Talk stays polite and general until the visitor's own manner makes clear what kind of man he is. The knives at every hip in the room are for the length of this meal, doing quiet double duty as the reason no one actually needs to say any of this out loud. This particular traveler, it turns out over the meal, is carrying real news rather than trouble. He has come up from a trading post on the coast, where a ship put in only days ago with iron goods, timber nobody on this side of the island can grow, and a little imported silver. And where talk in the booths ran, as it does most years, to which crews were fitting out a vessel for a summer voyage abroad. It is worth saying plainly, because the word this whole culture is remembered by so badly obscures it. Most people on this farm, on most farms like it, will never join a raid and will never particularly want to. Farming this unforgiving leaves little spare labor to risk on an ocean crossing, and the men who do go abroad most years go chiefly to trade, working the same coastal routes their fathers worked, carrying wool and dried fish and walrus ivory out, and bringing timber, grain, and silver back. Only a smaller, younger, more restless portion of any given generation ever actually goes raiding in the sense the word has come to mean everywhere else, and even they mostly do it as one option among several across a working life that is otherwise spent exactly like everyone else's, at exactly this kind of farm, doing exactly this kind of work. The traveler eats well, by this household standards. Some of what came off that ship at the coast, the traveler mentions between mouthfuls, was silver, and not the kind stamped by any king this household would recognize. Coins struck far to the east, in the lands of the Caliphate, carried north and west along river routes, through lands few people on this farm could place on any map, valued here not for whatever ruler's name is pressed into them, but for the plain weight of the metal itself, cut and weighed on scales when a transaction calls for a precise amount rather than a whole coin. A household's wealth on this coast is measured the same way whenever it moves beyond livestock and cloth, by weight of silver rather than by any single trusted currency. And hoards of exactly this kind of foreign coin, buried for safekeeping and never recovered by owners history lost track of, turn up often enough, centuries later, that archaeologists treat them as some of the clearest proof available of just how far this world's trade actually reached, and is given a place near the fire for the night before he moves on toward farms further along the coast, carrying this household's own news outward the same way he carried the coast's news in. It is, in its quiet way, the day's only real contact with anything beyond the fences and the ridgeline, and by the time the meal breaks up, the afternoon's work is already waiting, indifferent to how welcome or how interesting the morning's visitor turned out to be. The trouble this afternoon announces itself quietly, which is how most of it does. A length of the turf wall marking off this farm's reserved hay meadow from the next farm's outfield has been pushed down in one place, deliberately, by the look of the flattened turf rather than by weather. And a dozen of the neighbors' sheep have clearly been through it, and grazed a section of ground this household was counting on standing untouched until the summer cutting. It sounds small, described that way. It is not small. Every blade of grass in that meadow was already spoken for in the hay arithmetic that decides which animals eat through to spring, and a neighbor's flock quietly helping itself to a piece of that arithmetic is, in a subsistence economy with almost no slack in it, a direct threat to this household's winter. What happens next is the part a modern visitor, raised on the assumption that a call to some distant authority solves this kind of problem, would find genuinely disorienting. There is no one to call. Iceland's assembly, founded a generation or so before this afternoon, has a law speaker who can recite the law from memory, and courts that can hear a case and hand down a verdict. But it has no king behind any of that, no standing force of any kind, no officer who can be sent out to a farm to make a losing party comply. A verdict at law in this country is only ever the first half of a resolution. The second half, actually collecting compensation, actually stopping the trespass, actually making a stubborn or defiant neighbor honor a judgment against him, is left entirely to the injured party and whatever kinsmen, hired hands, and allies he can bring to bear on the problem himself. Winning a case and enforcing it are two separate and separately difficult achievements, and a household with no standing, no allies, and no reputation for following through can win every argument at law and still walk away with nothing. This is why the farmer's first move this afternoon is not toward the neighbor's farm, but toward an accounting of his own position. Every free farmer in this district owes a kind of formal allegiance to one of the local chieftains, a bond that runs in both directions. The farmer offers backing and support when the chieftain needs it, and the chieftain, in turn, is expected to stand behind his own people at the assembly, and if it comes to it, back a just claim with more than words. A farmer with a strong chieftain, a wide circle of kin, and a reputation for being exactly as troublesome as a wrong done to him, deserves as a farmer whose boundary walls tend to stay standing. A farmer known to be isolated, unsupported, or easily cowed is a farmer whose meadows get quietly grazed again the following season, because the calculation on the other side of the fence has already priced in how little it will cost to do it. The confrontation itself, when it comes, happens at the boundary in the flat afternoon light, and for a handful of very long seconds, it is genuinely unclear which way it will go. Both men have come with support rather than alone. Both are armed the way every free man in this country is armed, as a matter of course, and the same small knives that spent the morning cutting bread and shaving kindling are, in this particular quarter hour, being read very differently by everyone present, weighed as the plain fact that this disagreement could become something much worse than a disagreement, with very little further provocation. Voices stay hard rather than loud, hands rest near belts rather than on them. Nothing is drawn today, in this instance. The neighbor, pressed and outnumbered in support, if not in stubbornness, agrees tightly to make the wall good and to answer for the grazing at the next local assembly, rather than force the argument any further this particular afternoon. It is not quite peace, and not quite victory. It is a de-escalation, purchased by a visible willingness on both sides to have gone further, and everyone walking away from that fence line understands perfectly well how thin the margin was. If it had gone further, the path forward was already well understood by everyone standing there. Killing in this society is not, in itself, automatically the crime a modern legal system would assume it to be. It can be answered with a payment of compensation, negotiated by kin on both sides and set by custom, or by a court's judgment, closing the matter formally if both parties honor the settlement. What the law will not tolerate is concealment. A killing hidden rather than declared is treated far more harshly than one openly admitted, and what a court can impose on a man who will not pay, will not yield, or has committed a crime too serious for any payment to cover is the heaviest sentence this society has: full outlawry, which strips a man of every legal protection he has. An outlawed man can be killed by anyone, anywhere without consequence to the killer. He forfeits his property, and he must leave the country, or live as a hunted thing in its wildest, least hospitable corners. There is no prison in this system. There does not need to be one. A society this small and this exposed has instead built a sentence that simply removes a person from the community's protection altogether and lets the country's own hostility finish the job. None of that happened today, and the farmer walking back from the boundary wall knows exactly how much better an outcome that is than the alternative. But he also knows the matter is not closed, only postponed to a more formal reckoning, and that postponement itself is a kind of currency few modern disputes ever require anyone to think about: the patience to wait months for an assembly to sit, and the standing, built over years of exactly this kind of quiet vigilance, to be confident the wait will still end in his favor. Not everyone working this farm today is working it by choice. In the afternoon's harder, dirtier tasks, the heaviest hauling, the coldest outdoor work, whatever the free household would rather not do itself, fall disproportionately to the one or two thralls this household owns outright, as property. Under a legal status, the sagas and law codes of this culture describe in plain and unembarrassed terms. A thrall might have arrived at this status by any of several roads: captured on a raid and brought home rather than sold onward, purchased at one of the trading posts where such transactions are handled with the same unremarkable practicality as a cattle sale, born to a thrall mother and inheriting her status automatically, or fallen into bondage through a debt no other resource could settle. Whatever the road, the legal reality at the far end of it is the same. A thrall can be bought, sold, worked, and in some circumstances killed with a legal consequence far lighter than the same act against a free person would carry, because the law, however sophisticated its handling of disputes among free men, treats an unfree person as property first, and a person only after that. It would be a comfortable lie to describe this arrangement as gentler than its reputation suggests, and the record does not support the comfort. Far to the east, on the Volga River, a traveling diplomat from the Abbasid court named Ibn Fadlan spent time among Norse traders in the early 10th century, and left behind one of the only outside eyewitness accounts of this culture that survives from anyone who was not himself part of it. Among the practices he describes in careful, startled detail is a chieftain's funeral, in which an enslaved woman was ritually killed to accompany her master into the next world, a scene so specific and so alien to his own expectations that historians still argue over exactly how representative it was of Norse practice generally, rather than a particular custom of the Volga trading communities he happened to be observing. It is not evidence of what happens on this farm, on this afternoon, in this much quieter corner of the Norse world. It is evidence of how far the logic of ownership could be taken elsewhere when the person owned was reduced fully to the value assigned her. On an ordinary farm like this one, the more common reality is grinding rather than Gothic. A thrall's labor absorbed into the household's routines, and any compensation owed flows to the owner rather than to the person who suffered the injury. And yet the same law that denies a thrall standing does grant him a path, however narrow, out of the condition. Manumission, the formal freeing of a thrall by an owner, is recognized and recorded, and a freed person, a status with its own name and its own lesser but real legal footing, can in time see his own children born fully free. Some thralls on prosperous farms are given small plots to work on their own account, are allowed to accumulate a little property, and are eventually bought free by their own labor, a route out that is real without being remotely common or fast. The broader pattern, visible only from a distance no one alive on this farm today can actually see, day to day, the difference shows up less in cruelty, most of the time, than in simple allocation. The thralls eat after the free household rather than alongside it, sleep at the colder end of the bench nearer the door, and own, in practice, whatever small personal items their owner tolerates, rather than whatever they might otherwise have chosen for themselves. A reasonable owner, and most owners on ordinary farms have every practical reason to be reasonable, understands that a starved, injured, or despairing thrall is simply a damaged piece of property, producing less labor than a well-kept one, and treats his own thralls accordingly, which is a far lower bar than kindness, and still on many farms, higher than the law strictly requires him to clear. A thrall freed outright takes on a new legal name for the condition, a freedman or freedwoman, standing above bondage but still, for a time, tied to a former owner by lingering obligations the law spells out in careful detail, rather than leaving to custom alone. It is a real door, even if very few thralls on any given farm walk through it in a given generation, and its existence changes the calculation on both sides of the household's daily arithmetic. A thrall with a plausible, if distant, path to freedom has a reason to work carefully, rather than merely under duress, and an owner weighing the cost of that path against the cost of a resentful, minimally cooperative worker often finds the arithmetic favors letting the door stay open. That is, that the whole institution is already, slowly losing ground. Thrall holding will not vanish suddenly or dramatically. There is no single decree, no single generation that ends it. It will simply become rarer across the coming century, tied loosely to the same current pulling this country toward the new religion its neighbors have already adopted, and to a shifting economic reality in which an unfree, unmotivated workforce turns out to make less agricultural sense on marginal land than a free tenant with a stake in his own harvest. None of that comfort reaches the two thralls hauling frozen turf across this farm's yard this particular afternoon, for whom the day's arithmetic of cold and labor is identical to everyone else's, minus the wages, minus the standing, minus any real say in when the work ends. By late afternoon, the light is already beginning its early winter retreat, and the household's attention is turning, as it does every day at this hour, toward the one part of the farm's daily arithmetic that concerns no ledger and no law at all, the fact that childbirth, somewhere on this stretch of coast this same season, is quietly killing women at a rate no other single hazard on this farm can match. The news that reaches this farm in the last of the afternoon light is the kind that travels fast along an isolated coastline precisely because everyone understands, without needing it explained, exactly what is at stake. A woman on a neighboring farm has been in a hard labor since the previous night, and the messenger's face, more than his actual words, tells the household most of what it needs to know about how that labor is going. There is no physician to send for, no hospital within any distance that would matter, only the accumulated hard-won knowledge of the older women of the district, who move between farms at times like this the way a skilled tradesman moves between jobs, carrying whatever practical experience 2 or 3 decades of attending births has taught them, and very little else. That practical knowledge is real, and it is also, by any modern clinical standard, thin protection against what can go wrong: a birth that stalls, a child positioned wrong, bleeding that will not slow once it starts. Any of these, manageable today in a hospital with trained surgeons and blood on hand, is frequently fatal here, and the numbers behind that plain fact are sobering in a way this household does not need a scholar to explain to them, because most families on this coast have already lost a mother, a sister, or a wife to exactly this hazard at least once. Historians who study demographic records from societies without modern obstetric care across many centuries and many places find the same pattern again and again. Childbirth stands among the very few hazards capable of killing healthy young women in their prime at a rate that rivals or exceeds the dangers faced by the men in the same households, whether those men are farming, trading, or fighting. It is, in the truest sense, the one risk in this entire world that falls almost entirely on one sex, silently, on an ordinary schedule, without any of the recognition a battle death or a shipwreck receives in the sagas. What can be done for the woman on the neighboring farm tonight is what has always been done. There is at least one thread in this culture's own belief that seems to reach for some honor equal to the risk, whatever comfort it actually offered the women living under it. In the stories this household tells about the old gods, one goddess is said to receive into her own hall, alongside half of those who die gloriously in battle, women who die in a different kind of struggle entirely, and some who study this mythology read that pairing as this culture's own acknowledgement, however oblique, that surviving childbirth was its own kind of combat, fought without weapons, and just as capable of ending a life in its prime. The women who attend a birth like this one are known, in this culture's own language, by a name that translates roughly as Light Mother, the one who brings the child into the light of the world, and whatever the term's exact origin, it captures plainly enough what the role actually is. Not a physician with tools or training in any sense a later century would recognize, but the single most trusted, most experienced pair of hands available, doing everything experience has taught her to do, and then, when experience runs out, simply staying. Every household with a woman nearing her time makes what preparations it can well in advance rather than waiting on events. Clean cloth set aside, word quietly sent ahead to whichever experienced woman is likeliest to be needed, small stores kept back specifically against the days of a hard recovery. None of it guarantees an outcome. All of it is simply what foresight can offer against a risk this household has learned, across generations, not to leave to chance, any more than the winter's hay. Herbal preparations passed down through generations of practical trial, positions and physical support learned from experience rather than anatomy, an attendant's steady hands, and when things turned genuinely dangerous, very little beyond raw endurance and whatever protective charm or quiet prayer the household still trusts. This close to a religious turn the whole country has not yet fully made. There is no germ theory here, no understanding of infection as a specific nameable process rather than a mysterious ill humor or an offended spirit. A wound from a difficult birth that turns hot and foul in the days afterward is simply, to everyone watching it happen, bad luck of a particularly cruel kind, arriving with no warning and responding to nothing anyone knows how to do about it. The risk does not end with the mother either. Infant mortality in this era is high by any modern measure, for reasons that have far more to do with infection, cold, and the countless small accidents of early life than with any lack of care from parents who, by every account the sagas and later law preserve, love their children with the same intensity people always have. It is worth saying plainly, because a popular shorthand about this whole era gets the point backward. The reason average life expectancy across a population like this one looks so low, when later scholars finally calculate it, is not that a person who reached adulthood was already old and finished at 30. It is that so many children die in their first years that they drag the average down hard, while the men and women who actually survive childhood's dangerous first decade go on, in very ordinary numbers, to see their 50s, their 60s, sometimes considerably further, weathered and marked by the same hard labor as everyone else on this coast, but very much still living. Averages applied carelessly across an entire population hide exactly the story they should be telling. Word will not come from the neighboring farm about how the night resolved until morning at the earliest, and there is nothing more this household can usefully do about it tonight, except the same thing it does about every other risk on this coast that has no remedy: finish the day's remaining work and hope. The evening meal gathers the whole household back around the long hearth, at the hour when the outdoor work has finally, genuinely run out of daylight to justify itself. And the seating arrangement along the hall's benches is not casual, whatever a stranger glancing in might assume. At the center of one long bench sits the high seat, flanked by a pair of carved timber posts that mark it out from the ordinary planks running the rest of the wall, and it belongs, by an understanding no one on this farm has ever had to state aloud, to the household's head. Archaeologists excavating Norse halls of this period have recovered exactly this kind of high seat post, sometimes elaborately carved, confirming in wood what the sagas already describe in words, that where a person sat in the hall was never neutral information. It announced standing, and a guest seated close to the high seat was a guest being honored, just as a guest seated far down the bench was being told something quieter and less flattering about his place in the evening. Tonight's meal is a shade better than the morning's, because the evening meal generally is, drawing more freely on the day's small store of variety: meat from the autumn slaughter, perhaps a portion of dried fish softened by boiling, the same skyer and bread as always, and, if the household can spare it without troubling the winter's tally too much, a cup of home-brewed ale passed and shared rather than measured out with the same careful eye applied to the morning's bread. Conversation over a meal like this is not incidental. It is one of the very few forms of entertainment, education, and news distribution this household has access to on an ordinary night, and it tends, as the meal winds down and the fire is fed a little higher against the coming cold, toward the same thing conversation around this hearth turns to on most evenings: a story, told by whoever in the household tells stories best, drawing on a shared stock of tales about ancestors, gods only half believed in anymore by some of the younger listeners, and journeys undertaken by men this household is actually related to. Tonight, though, the talk circles first around nearer business: the boundary wall, the neighbor's sheep, and the promise tight-voiced and reluctantly given at a fence line that afternoon to answer for it properly rather than let it fester. An older voice at the table, one that has sat through more than a few such disputes in its time, points out, as older voices in this position always eventually do, that this is exactly the kind of case that gets raised and properly settled at the summer assembly. When representatives from every district gather, verdicts are handed down by men trained in the law, and a wronged farmer with the standing to see the thing through can walk away with a payment in silver or livestock, rather than a wall that keeps getting pushed down every few years. It is not the first time this particular household has taken a grievance that far, and it will very likely not be the last. In the retelling of an old case, who was wronged, what was paid, how the matter finally closed, does double duty at a table like this one. It is entertainment, and it is also, quietly, a lesson for the household's younger members in exactly how this whole unpoliced system of law actually holds together without anyone standing over it with a sword. The fire is fed again as the meal winds down. Not every evening ends in a story of this length. Some nights the household instead sets out a board, scored with squares, a king piece at its center, and a ring of defenders against a larger circling force of attackers, a game of pursuit and defense that several of the household's men and women play with real seriousness and no small amount of pride in a well-earned whim. And the stories themselves, when they are told, rarely arrive in plain language. This culture prizes a compressed, riddling way of naming ordinary things. The sea rendered as a whale's road, a sword as an icicle of battle, a kind of verbal craft that takes years to compose well, and that a good storyteller deploys as naturally as a smith reaches for the right hammer. Decoration that is also in its way, another skill this household spends real effort keeping alive. The youngest listeners tonight are not merely being entertained by any of this, whatever it might look like from outside. There is no separate schoolroom on this farm, no tutor, no text a child might be handed to learn this country's history, its law, or its own family's standing among its neighbors. All of it arrives exactly this way, absorbed across years of half-attentive evenings by the hearth, until a child who could not have recited a single one of tonight's stories on command somehow grows into an adult who knows, without ever having been formally taught, roughly how a boundary dispute gets settled, and roughly what their own grandfather did the summer the assembly heard his case, throwing more light than the little oil lamps ever could across faces that have been outdoors, in one hard task or another, for most of the hours since before dawn. There is real comfort in this hour, the kind that doesn't show up in any tally of hardship. Full stomachs, warmth, kin gathered in one place, a story about to be told that everyone has heard some version of before and will happily hear again. It is also, whether the household frames it this way or not, the hour in which the country's entire system of law and order gets passed down, one retelling at a time, from the people who remember how a particular case was settled to the children who will one day have to settle their own. The story that follows the meal, once the boundary dispute has been turned over and set aside for the summer assembly to settle, drifts naturally toward the assembly itself, because almost every substantial story in this household stock eventually does. It meets once a year, for about 2 weeks in early summer, on a great rift plain where the land itself is said to be tearing slowly apart, and it draws people from every corner of the island, farmers with cases to bring, chieftains with followings to display, traders with goods to sell, young people looking, as young people at any gathering of this size always are, for a match worth making. At its center stands a single officer unlike any other in this country, the law speaker, elected to the position for a term of years, whose entire qualification for the job is that he has committed the whole of the country's law to memory and can recite any part of it on demand, because none of it, in this generation, exists anywhere in writing at all. That fact alone is worth sitting with. There is no law book on this farm, no written statute anywhere in the country a farmer could consult if a dispute turned on some fine point of procedure. The law lives entirely in the law speaker's memory and in the collective memory of everyone who has sat through enough assemblies to absorb its general shape, and the law speaker's discipline of reciting the whole of it aloud from a raised outcrop of rock at the assembly's heart across a rotating 3-summer cycle is the only mechanism this society has for making sure the law does not quietly drift or get misremembered into something a powerful man finds more convenient. It will be decades yet before a churchman named Haflidy Masson persuades the assembly to have the law written down at last, over 2 winters, so that memory can finally be checked against a fixed text, rather than trusted entirely on its own. For this farm, tonight, all of that lies in the future. The law is what the law speaker says it is, and what enough people in the crowd remember it as being, and the whole system works only because so many people have a stake in remembering it accurately. The story that gets told most often, because it is simply the best story this country's own history has to offer, concerns a summer some 50 years from tonight that none of the people at this hearth will live to see, though their grandchildren will hear it as living memory. A summer in which two irreconcilable factions, the country's Christians and the country's followers of the old gods, arrived at the assembly on the edge of open violence, each side unwilling to live any longer under the other's law. The law speaker of that future summer, still formally a follower of the old gods himself, is remembered as having withdrawn to his booth, lain down under a cloak for a full day and night without speaking to anyone, and emerged to deliver a single ruling binding on the entire country, that all should be baptized and the old sacrifices given up in public, but that private practice of the old ways would be quietly tolerated for a time, and that the eating of horse meat, forbidden under the new religion, would still be allowed until feelings had settled. It held. A country that had been one vote away from splitting into two hostile jurisdictions accepted a single man's compromise rather than fight over it. And the reason it accepted the ruling, this household storyteller always insists, has nothing to do with the ruling being popular, and everything to do with what this whole evening has already been circling. A society with no king to force a decision has to actually believe in the process that produces one, or the process is worth nothing at all. It is, when the story finishes and the fire is banked a little lower for the coming night, the gathering itself, when this household's own men have attended it, is as much a fair and a market as it is a court. Temporary turf-walled booths, rebuilt on the same footprints year after year by the same families, ring the assembly plain. And for the 2 weeks it runs, the place holds more people, more news, and more goods in one location than this household otherwise sees in an entire year. Cases argued before appointed judges under procedures as fixed and as memorized as the law itself. Marriages proposed and settled, disputes between districts that have nothing to do with any one farmer's boundary wall, and, running underneath all of it, the same plain truth that makes the whole system work at all, which is that a verdict handed down in front of most of the country's most influential men is a verdict that carries a social weight no quiet arrangement back home could ever match. The ground itself adds its own weight to the occasion. The rift plain where the country gathers sits in a wide, dramatic valley where a wall of dark rock rises sheer along one side, the visible edge, local belief holds, of two great pieces of the earth easing slowly apart from one another, and a speaker standing on the outcrop at its heart can be heard, by some trick of the rock face behind him, by a crowd far larger than his own voice should reasonably carry. No one who has stood in that crowd forgets the sound of a law speaker's recitation rolling back off that stone, the clearest possible answer to the question a modern listener would eventually have to ask about a country with no police and no executive. How does any of this actually hold together? It holds together because everyone in it, from the household reciting this story tonight to the law speaker standing on his rock in a summer not yet arrived, has been raised inside a shared, memorized, endlessly rehearsed understanding of what the rules are and what happens to a person who breaks them, reinforced not by force, but by the simple, relentless social fact that everyone is watching, everyone remembers, and no one wants to be the person the next winter's stories are told about. Once the story is told and the meal fully cleared, the household settles towards sleep in the same room it has occupied all day, and the dark outside the turf walls is now a different, more absolute thing than the dark of early morning, because there is no possibility left in it of a sunrise only an hour or two off. This far north in winter, true night runs long, and this household, like every household on this coast, treats the hours inside it with a wariness that has nothing to do with cold or with wolves, of which Iceland famously has none, and everything to do with beliefs about what else might be abroad in it. The sagas of this culture are full of the restless dead, figures who do not stay quietly in their graves but rise again, physically strong and actively malicious, to trouble the living who wronged them, or simply to guard the wealth buried with them past any reasonable claim of ownership. Whether every person in this hall tonight believes it with equal conviction is impossible to know and probably always was. Belief of this kind rarely arrives as a single settled fact, even for the people holding it. But the precautions taken are real regardless of how literally any one mind takes the underlying story. Some burials of this period, when archaeologists eventually opened them many centuries later, show a body weighted down with stones, or bound, or laid in a position that looks deliberately awkward for rising, precautions that at least some archaeologists reading the evidence take as a practical response to exactly this fear. Not sentiment toward the dead, but a working attempt to keep them where they were put. Iron carries its own reputation after dark that has nothing to do with cutting anything. Whoever draws the unwelcome task of stepping back outside before morning, for the sake of the animals or simple necessity, does not do it without a light, and does not linger once outside it. Certain rocks and rises on this farm's own land are understood without much discussion to belong to beings that were here before the family and will outlast it, and a sensible household disturbs that ground as little as possible, offers it a measure of quiet respect, and does not, as a rule, dig or build carelessly on a spot the older generation has quietly marked as best left alone. Whether this counts as belief, habit, or simple caution against a cost that costs nothing to avoid paying is not a distinction anyone on this farm feels any need to resolve tonight. Small protective marks, cut or scratched into a doorpost or a roof beam at the building itself, are common enough across this culture's farms that no one visiting this hall would find them worth remarking on. A quiet, unspoken insurance layered onto the barred door and the banked fire, asking for nothing more than a little continued goodwill from whatever the dark might otherwise send toward a house full of sleeping people. Birds carry their own weight of meaning here, awake or asleep. A raven's call at an odd hour is noted, if not always openly discussed, by a culture whose highest god is said to keep two of the birds as his own eyes and ears across the world, and a household inclined to worry finds omens in a great many ordinary sounds once the fire is banked, and the imagination has nothing left to occupy it but the dark outside the wall. There is at least no one facing any of it alone. Whatever this night holds, it holds for a full bench of sleepers packed shoulder to shoulder against the same cold and the same dark, and a fear shared by a dozen people, rightly or wrongly, has always felt smaller than a fear faced by one. A blade laid near a sleeping child, or worn rather than set aside even at night, is trusted by some in this household to unsettle the kind of thing that walks in the dark hours, the same plain metal that spent the whole day cutting bread and shaving kindling, doing a second, entirely different job once the light is gone. It is one more way this culture's single most common possession turns out to be carrying more weight than its size suggests. Present at the hip through an ordinary working day, and just as present, for a different reason entirely, once that day has ended. It is worth pausing here on the shape a stranger centuries removed from this hall would expect this fear and this whole culture to take, because so much of it is invented rather than remembered. No one warming himself at this fire tonight, and no warrior this household's men will ever become for a season or two of trading or raiding, owns or has ever seen a helmet with horns on it. The image belongs to a theater costume designer working more than 9 centuries after this evening, dressing an opera for a stage audience that wanted its Norse ancestors to look suitably savage and mythic. And the horned helmet has simply never left popular memory since, however little it resembles anything an actual smith on this coast has ever forged. What this household actually fears tonight is quieter, and in its way, more unsettling than a monster with horns. The plain dark itself, and whatever in the old stories might still be walking through it, kept at bay by nothing more dramatic than a banked fire, a barred door, and a blade kept close at hand until morning. The last of the household to lie down checks the door's bar out of habit rather than any specific alarm, glances once at the hearth's dull red heart, banked now for the night the same careful way it will be banked every night this winter, and finds a place on the packed earth bench among the others, shoulder to shoulder for warmth in the old practiced way. Sleep does not come easily to everyone in this room tonight. It rarely does, on a farm where the day's aches have had no chance yet to fade, before the next days are due to begin. Somewhere past the middle of the night, when the rest of the hall has settled into the uneven breathing of actual sleep, one of the household's older hands is still awake, working a familiar ache out of a shoulder that has not moved freely in years, ever since a fall from a haystack during a summer harvest left it stiff in a way that never fully resolved. There is nothing to be done for it beyond what has already been done, a poultice of herbs applied out of long habit more than confidence, and the same patient endurance that gets this body through every other hardship the day hands it. There is no pain relief here beyond what plants, heat, and time can offer, and none of the three is reliable. A modern visitor with a headache reaches for a small tablet and forgets the headache within the hour. A person on this farm with a genuinely troublesome pain simply carries it, sometimes for years, sometimes for the rest of a life that is not, by the standards of the work it demands, especially long to begin with. This is the accounting a body keeps that no law, no tally, and no assembly can settle on anyone's behalf. Across the room, someone else stirs with a cough that has not fully cleared in weeks. The same smoke that keeps this whole household from freezing, doing its own slow damage to lungs that have never known a winter without it. Isotope analysis of teeth and bone, a technique no one in this hall could begin to imagine, lets researchers centuries later reconstruct roughly what a body like this one actually ate across a lifetime. And dental ware alone tells its own story of grit milled bread and teeth pressed into service as tools, worn down decades ahead of anything a modern dentist would consider normal. When an injury is severe enough to require more than a poultice and patience, when a crushed limb has to come off to save the rest of a life, it comes off with a blade and whatever the patient's own will and a few strong hands can hold still through, because there is nothing here that dulls pain beyond what exhaustion and shock provide on their own. Skulls examined from burial grounds of this period sometimes show a porous, sponge-like change to the bone around the eye sockets and across the crown, a marker researchers associate with real, sustained nutritional stress, usually suffered hardest in childhood, written into the skeleton permanently even in people who went on to live perfectly functional adult lives afterward. The women of this household carry their own version of the same ledger, distinct from the men's but no lighter. Joints and pelvic bone visibly remodeled by repeated childbearing, a toll bioarchaeologists reading female skeletons of this era find, just as reliably as the wear in a laborer's shoulder, evidence of a cost paid not once, but as many times as a body was asked to pay it. No one in this hall tonight would describe any of this in the clinical language a much later century will eventually use to catalog it. They would simply call it getting older, the ordinary price of a long working life, paid the same way every person they have ever known has paid it, and borne with the same unremarked patience that gets this household through everything else the day demands. The body here forgets nothing, it simply carries every deficit forward, visible to anyone with the training to read it, for as long as the skeleton itself survives to be read. Every fall, every burn from cooking too close to an open hearth, every wrenched joint from hauling a load a fraction too heavy, every winter's frostbite nibbling at fingers and toes, leaves something behind that does not fully go away, because there is no surgery to set a badly healed bone properly after the fact, and no medicine to fully close a wound that has already gone the wrong way. Bioarchaeologists who study skeletons from this era read this exact record in bone. Fractures healed at odd angles because no one could hold them straight while they mended. Teeth worn down to the root from being used as a third hand for softening leather or gripping thread. Joints changed permanently by decades of the same repeated motion. A body here is less like a possession maintained across a lifetime and more like a ledger, entries added and never subtracted, until the ledger itself eventually gives out. It would be easy, hearing all of this, to reach for the comfortable old shorthand and assume that a person here simply was not expected to grow old, that 30 was already an accomplishment and 40 a small miracle. The truth, when scholars actually work through the surviving skeletal evidence rather than repeat the old assumption, is both harsher and less tidy than that. What drags the average age of death down so low across a population like this one is overwhelmingly the sheer number of children who do not survive their first years, taken by exactly the infections, accidents, and hard winters that this whole day has already made plain, have no real remedy here. Strip those childhood deaths back out of the count, and the adults who actually made it through their first dangerous decade turn out in burial after burial to have gone on living in perfectly ordinary numbers into their 50s and 60s, weathered, scarred, often in real pain by the standards of a modern clinic, but very much alive and very much still working. The man lying awake tonight with his stiff shoulder is not a rarity beating the odds. He is closer to the ordinary outcome for anyone who got this far at all. None of that makes the shoulder hurt any less. He shifts again, finds an angle that aches slightly less than the last one, and lies still, listening to the wind working at the corner of the turf roof and the slow, familiar breathing of a dozen other bodies that will all, in their own way, be keeping some version of this same account by the time they reach his age, if they reach it at all. Outside, the night is not yet finished with any of them. The coldest hour of the whole cycle arrives well before any real light returns. The hour when the previous day has fully spent itself, and the next one has not yet announced any intention of beginning. And it is at exactly this hour that the hearth fire matters most and shows least. Raked down to its bed of ash the night before, it holds nothing now but a handful of dull coals doing the same quiet, essential work they have done every night this household can remember, keeping a thread of heat alive through the worst of the cold, so that tomorrow's firekeeper will kneel at this same hearth edge and find, with patient breath and a little dry grass, something left to build from, rather than nothing at all. It is held tonight. It is held most nights this household has ever known, because a household that lets it fail more than very rarely does not usually remain a household on this farm for long. Archaeologists who dig into the floors of longhouses like this one, centuries after everyone sleeping in this room tonight has died, find the proof of that continuity written directly into the ground. Hearths built up in layer after layer of ash and refired coal, the same central fire maintained, moved perhaps a hand's width one way or another as the floor was relaid, but never abandoned, for the entire working life of a house that might stand for generations. A single night's fire is a small, forgettable thing. A hearth maintained this way for 50 or 80 years, across grandparents and grandchildren who never met, is something closer to an institution. And this particular fire, banked one more time tonight by hands that will not always be the ones tending it, is already partway through becoming exactly that. Nearby, within easy reach of where its owner has finally settled into an uneasy sleep, lies the same small iron knife that shaved kindling before dawn, cut bread at breakfast, stood as the wordless center of a tense argument at a boundary wall in the afternoon, and now, after dark, does the last and strangest of its day's jobs, trusted simply by being close at hand to keep whatever the night holds a little further off. By the storehouse door, unseen and unremarkable in the dark, the notched tally waits for tomorrow's glance from the household's senior woman, who already knows, without needing to check it again tonight, roughly what number she will find, and roughly how many mornings like this one still stand between now and a spring that feels, at this exact hour, very far away indeed. None of the three objects a viewer was asked to watch at the start of this day did anything remarkable. Somewhere in this same house tonight, the traveler fed at midday sleeps his own borrowed sleep by the fire's edge, owing this household a debt of custom he will discharge at the next farm down the coast. The neighbors' sheep are back behind a wall that will hold, provisionally, until a summer court decides the argument properly. The thralls who hauled turf all afternoon are sleeping the same uneasy sleep as everyone else, no closer to freedom tonight than they were this morning, no further from it either. Word of the birth down the coast has still not come. Every thread this day opened is still in its own way open, waiting on tomorrow or next season or next summer's assembly to close it, because very little here resolves itself in a single day, and the household has long since stopped expecting that it would. Tomorrow will ask for the fire again, the buyer again, the storehouse tally again, in very nearly the same order, and the household sleeping through this final black hour already knows it, the way a person knows the shape of their own hands. There is no finish line anywhere in this life that a modern visitor would recognize as an ending, no season where the work finally stops for good. There is only the next morning and the one after it, for as long as the people living this particular version of it are able to keep going. That, finally, is the case this single day makes, more plainly than any single dramatic danger ever could. A modern visitor dropped into it would not be defeated by a battle, a monster, or even any one of the specific hardships this telling has walked through in turn. They would be defeated by the sheer refusal of any of it to stop, by a body that cannot opt out of the cold, or the labor, or the risk, for even a single hour without someone else quietly absorbing the cost, in a world that offers no thermostat, no clinic, and no rest day to retreat to, when the accumulation finally becomes too much. The household sleeping through this last black hour has no comparison to make. This is only ever what a day is. The fire only avoided going out. The knife only kept being useful. The tally only kept counting. That in the end is the whole and complete answer to the question this day was built to ask. A person dropped into this house at any single hour of it, faced with any one of its demands alone, might well manage, could probably survive one hard morning of hauling frozen turf, or one tense conversation at a fence line, or one night of genuine cold, given enough determination and a little luck. What breaks a visitor unused to this life is not any one of those hours. It is all of them, arriving in the same 24 with no modern comfort standing between the body and any single one of them, day after day, for as many years as the body can be made to last. This household does not experience its own existence as heroic or especially hard. It is simply the only life anyone here has ever known, endured the way anyone endures the only life available to them. One banked fire and one counted day at a time. Outside at last, almost too gradually to notice, the black over the ridge is beginning, very slightly, to thin. Nothing about this day required a battle, a monster, or a single dramatic turn of fate to make its case. It required only 24 ordinary hours, followed honestly through a longhouse in Iceland 1,000 years ago. A fire that could not be allowed to die, animals whose survival was the household's own, a diet with no margin for waste, a body worked past what any modern desk or factory would ask of it, wool spun by hand into the only warmth this climate would allow, a blade carried for cutting bread that everyone understood could, without much warning, be asked to do something else, a stranger fed because the law of hospitality made that almost non-negotiable, a dispute that had to be settled without a single police officer anywhere in the country, an unfree household member whose labor this whole account has tried not to look away from, a birth somewhere on the coast that might easily kill the woman having it, an evening spent teaching the young how an entire legal order holds together with no king enforcing it, a night genuinely feared for what might be walking in it, and a body by the day's end, quietly keeping score of costs that no medicine on this farm could ever fully repay. Any one of these, faced alone for one day only, is survivable, and people raised in far softer circumstances have managed harder single ordeals than any single piece of this one. What this day actually demands is all of it together, compounding hour on hour, with nothing to fall back on when the margin runs out. No thermostat, no pharmacy, no supermarket, no telephone, no authority to call when the law needs enforcing, no anesthetic when the body finally fails at something. The household that lived this day did not consider itself unusually tough. It had never known anything else to measure itself against, and toughness, examined honestly, is very often just this, the ordinary condition of people who never had the choice to be soft. What survived out of a day like this one is mostly silence. No name attaches to the woman who woke the fire this particular morning, or the hand who mended the wall, or the smith who straightened the hoe blade, or the messenger who carried word of a hard berth up the coast. They are recovered only in aggregate, in the ash layers under a rebuilt hearth, in a knife found in a grave, in a law once spoken aloud from a rock, and only much later written down, in the bones of people who worked harder, and if they survived their own childhoods, generally lived longer than the popular memory of this era ever gives them credit for. The fire this household banked at the end of this one day would be built up again the next morning, and the next, long after every person who tended it tonight was gone, by hands that never knew their names and kept the same coal alive regardless.